It's a very difficult talk because it's difficult to accuse other scientists of scientific misconduct. And I do it only because I believe two things are going on that are even worse. I believe this movement in this area is anti-science and it's anti-American. And I'm going to explain this further as we go into the talk. But what you can do as an audience is you can evaluate what I've done, and you can see if you think I've made my case. And you can also approach the people I've accused and ask them to respond. And so this can work in several ways, but just simply being a passive observer is no longer acceptable. If we're going to make progress in this area, we've got to actually confront things that we believe are wrong. First of all, maybe I should say a little bit about my background. I've had a PhD in physics for 47 years, but I have an unusual switch. I became an epidemiologist starting in 1973 because of a number of fortunate circumstances and being trained by a renowned epidemiologist at UCLA. And so I've spent almost my entire career as an epidemiologist, but I still think like a physicist. And that drives epidemiologists crazy. So what I'd like to say is I've only been involved in this for the last 15 years. I got a call from a wonderful career air pollution environmental scientist named Dr. Frederick Lipford in early 2002. And he got me interested in this field. And then one of the first sources that I read on this was this little green book called A Particulate Air Pollution Controversy by Robert Phelan. This is a very important document and came out in 2002. And I even have posted it online. I pay an extra fee to Amazon, and you can read this online. So if people are interested, that's one other way of reading this book. But it's an extremely important book, and I really appreciate the compliments that Bob Phelan made about me. And compliments go back to him, too, because he played a critical role in making it possible for my career to continue. Now, let's go over the main points I want to talk about. The basics, a few basics on PM2.5 and premature deaths. Second is the problems with the epidemiology of these claims. Third is the American Cancer Society data, known as the Cancer Prevention Study 2, and the claims that they've made since 1995. Then there is the analysis that I've been able to do with that data, which was not supposed to happen, but I'll explain more later, that shows there are no premature deaths in that cohort. And then the difficulties, because scientists and journals block null results in this area. And finally, there must be an end to this secret science, and there must be a reassessment of the EPA NOx, whatever it's pronounced. Okay, so basically, fine particulate matter is defined by its size, not its composition. And this has been stressed before. And some major sources are forest fires, residential burning, diesel engines, and in California, a major source is China, where on some days they're up to 30% comes across the Pacific Ocean. EPA established this National Ambient Air Quality Standard for PM2.5 as 15 micrograms per cubic meter. And this was in 1997. It was lowered to 12 micrograms per cubic meter in 2012. And most of this has been done, justified on what's called secret science epidemiology. And these regulations are very powerful, and they've been used to justify multi-billion-dollar regulations across the United States, state implementation plans, air quality management plans, the CARB truck and bus regulation, and the EPA Clean Power Plan are examples. Now, this is to restate a point that was made earlier by Professor Phelan. The average U.S. adult, and this is ballpark numbers, now inhales about 1 gram of PM2.5 in an 80-year lifespan. And this is based on the volume of the amount of air inhaled per day, roughly 10,000 liters per day. And so the amount, if you took outdoor air, has been calculated, say, roughly 4 or 5 grams or a teaspoon. This is about the amount that's in a bag of sugar, but not visible granules. These are invisible particles. And actually, though, as pointed out, the amount that's inhaled by people now with the lower levels of PM2.5 and the fact they're indoor most of the time, it's on the order of 1 gram. Just for comparison, the PM2.5 inhaled from 100 cigarettes is about 4 grams. So we're talking extremely low levels of this, which make the plausibility of its impact very small. The benefit of EPA regulations are justified primarily by a claim of premature deaths, where you assume there's $10 million in a value of statistical life. These assumptions are very shaky, but EPA's moved ahead with them anyway. And they assume that there's a causal relationship, which allows them to calculate this value of statistical life. And the entire exercise has come under severe criticism, but it still exists, and it's one of the factors we have to deal with. Now, I'd like to go briefly over 6 major problems that exist with the PM2.5 premature death claims. First is that I now have conclusive proof that the secret science that's been done, especially by the American Cancer Society, is invalid based on my reanalysis. And so secret science really doesn't have a valid role, but it's predominant in this area. There is no etiologic mechanism by which this small amount of PM2.5 could cause death. There is also no causal association that can be associated with such tiny relative risks has been done here. There's geographic and temporal variation that's unexplained. In other words, how can you set up a national standard if the risk varies across the country? There is an ecological fallacy which has plagued this from the very beginning, and that's the fact that people are assumed to be exposed to certain levels based on monitors that are actually nowhere near the individual subjects. In many cases, they're miles from the subject, but they're just assumed to have the level that a monitor is recorded at. And there's also other confounding variables that could impact the association that's being looked at, and most obviously other pollutants and other basic lifestyle factors. So these are major concerns. Now, the issue that I'm going to specifically focus on is the American Cancer Society's Cancer Prevention Study 2, which began in 1982 and is a follow-up of the original study, which began in 1959. I have a distinction of being the only independent scientist who's gotten access at the individual level to both databases. And in this particular case, we're dealing with CPS2, and the paper, a seminal paper, was published in March of 1995 by a professor, Arden Pope, BYU, as the lead author, and it used the American Cancer Society data. That paper was so controversial that there was a reanalysis done that was published in 2000 by the Health Effects Institute. And the point I'm going to make here is they never completed what they were mandated to do and checked to see how sensitive the results were to alternative data. Then there's a 2009 Health Effects Institute research report number 140 that was extending the follow-up of the original study, which went through 1989. The follow-up went through 2000. But that study then did not incorporate the data that I informed them of and others informed them of. And so again, basically ignored the criticisms that were mounting more than 10 years ago. And then my paper, which went online on March 28th of this year, is a reanalysis based on data that I gained access to about a year and a half ago. And I spent from June of 2016 through the end of 2016 trying to get it published. It was rejected by 7 different journals, including the journal that published the 1995 paper by Pope. Extreme difficulty in publishing contrary evidence. And this whole adventure is, if you believe in God, this is for me was an example, because this data has not been accessible by congressional subpoena, by repeated requests by different agencies ever since 1995, and yet I was able to get access to it in an old version. So I'm not dealing with the best version, but it's enough to make a strong case. This is the reanalysis, trying to go reconstruct what went on, because the original Pope paper was so controversial. They had to do a reanalysis of it to basically establish 2 things. Were the actual published findings accurately presented? In other words, if you did exactly what the authors did, would you get the results that they claimed to find? That part worked out as yes. The second part is what I have here on this slide as conduct sensitivity analyses to test the robustness of the original findings and interpretations to alternative analytic approaches. This was not done properly. And also, they didn't follow their mandate of putting together teams consisting of 2 to 4 epidemiologists, statisticians, and air pollution exposure experts. Now, with great difficulty, I extracted information from the Health Effects Institute, including the original request for qualifications. I have links at the bottom of these slides where you can actually look up on my website, the Scientific Integrity Institute, the full documents. But basically, there were 13 teams that responded, and HEI selected a 31-member team based in Canada, headed by statistician Daniel Kruski. It included a geographer named Michael Jarrett and another statistician named Richard Burnett. But it only had 1 epidemiologist named Ju Chen, who got a degree from Shanghai Medical University, and amazingly was not a co-author on either the 2000 or the 2009 HEI reports. So we have an epidemiological study based in the United States being criticized by a team in Canada that doesn't even have a prominent epidemiologist on it. This is very unsatisfactory, and this Health Effects Institute is receives tremendous amount of funding from EPA and the various industry sources. This was the first tip-off when I was analyzing this. I got this report a couple years after it came out in entire report and its appendices. There's a very interesting figure there called Figure 21. And it basically shows in 50 cities across the United States, which were analyzed, that the risk of PM2.5 varies substantially across the country. And it's concentrated mainly in the Rust Belt or the Ohio Valley, as you can see where the dark red and the red are. And it's actually reasonably low in California and throughout most of the western part of the United States. And so I asked in August, almost exactly 15 years ago, I asked the head of the Health Effects Institute, Daniel Greenbaum, and their lead scientist named Aaron Cohen to send me the underlying data on that map. In other words, that should just be part of their files on how whoever prepared that figure should have the backup documents so I could get this. This has been a 15-year game they've played of not revealing this. Now, I was able to break this down later, but that shows how, unprofessional this organization is when they can't answer a simple question like that. Now, this slide may be one of the most important in my talk because, and I'm simplifying all of this to stay within the time limit, but it's laid out in my publication that came out in March. Basically, what happens here is if you analyze the data that they used, you get their finding. And I did this sort of an indirect manner because I don't have exactly the same database they have. I have an early version, and what I did is used counties that could be identified using what is called a division and unit number that the American Cancer Society had as a part of the collection. These data were collected by about 70,000 researchers. I was one of them involved in 1982 that enrolled subjects in this study. And so that's one reason I know a lot about this, because I was actually involved at the very beginning. I knew the epidemiologists, the ACS at that time, wonderful, high quality, very professional people like Kyler Hammond and Lawrence Garfinkel. And they were able to assemble a group of over 1 million subjects throughout the United States. And so what I've done is I've tried to relate that because of the documentation I received and the data, which again, the data I got only covers the first 6 years of follow-up, which is the original follow-up that was planned from 82 to 88. So if you use the data that Pope used, and that's the line that I show at the bottom of the three. They're organized in three groups. What I call the HEI data, which is in one of their appendices. You get a positive ratio, which in this case is 1.08 as a relative risk. That means if you increase the PM2.5 levels by 10 micrograms per cubic meter, the relative risk of dying goes up by about 8%. But if you use the data that I used, which came out, it was major reports that came out in 1984 and 86 by a EPA investigator named Hinton, David Hinton, and that's what I call the IPN data, this inhalable particulate network that was set up across the United States. You come up with a non-significant effect. They're at 1.025. And the interesting point is, because of the evasion that I've experienced since March, I went back and I dug into this report further and found that the report actually contains the data that I used, although in a very mislabeled form and not exactly the same. And I have that labeled as the middle column, HEI-DC, which is in the table, it's called PM2.5 DC. If you use that data, you actually come out with no effect. So in other words, there's data in the report of 2000 which shows no effect. Amazingly, it wasn't analyzed in that report, although it was indirectly referred to in a couple of places. So this whole thing is very bizarre, and I'm trying to get to the bottom of it, but it's very hard because there's no cooperation going on. To break this down further, to show that I believe there were statistical tricks used, if you break the United States up into the Ohio Valley, which is Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, you see that all the ratios there are above 1.0, but they're statistically consistent with 1.0. If you look at the ratios outside the Ohio Valley, you see they're all virtually 1.0. And so my claim is that if they omitted from the Ohio Valley the analysis they would have gotten with any data would be non-significant. And so what they did is they combined the higher PM2.5 values and the higher mortality rates from the Ohio Valley with the rest of the United States, and they wound up getting this significant effect that I show here is 1.08. Their ratio was about 1.07. So this is really, really troubling, and they have to address this at some point. So far, after 5 months, no evidence that anything in my paper is wrong, just they're complaining that I'm not a very nice person. Now, I want to show you in more detail exactly how this data is listed. I picked out there were actually 11 counties in California that were part of this IPM network. And interestingly enough, they omitted 7 of the 11 in this analysis for reasons they haven't explained. And so if you see in the far right, under HEI, they used 50 different cities, and the only ones they included from California were Fresno, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Jose or Santa Clara County. And then if you look, I put also 2 other counties in here which represent the extremes. The paper in '95 was based primarily at that point on the extremes. So the bottom end, they had Albuquerque at 9 micrograms per cubic meter. See that in red at the bottom. And then they had Huntington, West Virginia as the high point at 34.5 micrograms per cubic meter. Now, this is very curious because the data that comes from the IPN network actually shows that the low was not there, or the high was not there. In fact, there is no measurement in the IPN for Huntington, West Virginia. It's in Wheeling, West Virginia, is one of the cities, which I show on the column that's over to the left under IPN. And so you see there, the low for the United States was in Santa Barbara County, and the high was in Riverside County, both in California. Both of these omitted from their analysis. And the analysis that I found in the appendix table called HEI-DC had more cities, but again, it only included 5 of the ones from California, but there were a total of 63 cities. The IPN network as a whole generates about 85 cities. So these are really major inconsistencies that need to be addressed by these investigators. And so far, nothing but silence. And so This is a sample. In other words, I have all of this down in meticulous detail, and these are points that the investigators must address if they want to maintain any credibility. So far, they haven't addressed them. This is an analysis that further proves, I believe, what problems exist and that my analysis is actually correct. If you look at a special analysis that was done, this was done in 2010 at the request of business groups in California who attended a conference. So all of us got together for, I think, maybe the first time in history, except maybe for one of Professor Phelan's conferences. It was in Sacramento. Professor Phelan was there. We had all the major players, and we were surrounded by a group of businessmen, many of whom John Dunn and I have known personally for a decade. And they were able to get an analysis done by HEI that dealt with the California portion of the national results. They just partitioned out what they found for California based on the table that existed in the 2009 version of this follow-up. And what it found was, amazingly, there was an inverse relationship in California. If you only look at the 4 counties, and the ratio comes out about 0.9, but it's actually significantly below 1.0. But the point is, this ratio I reproduced when I did my analysis. So using either the HEI data or my data, it still comes out with this inverse relationship. So that to me was an indication I was really on to the same data. And you see this holds here. There's a couple different ways that I did this analysis, but this is a bizarre relationship that it can't be ideologically correct, but shows what you can get when you're analyzing these results. So what I've done with this is just to further reinforce the fact that I believe I've done a very accurate analysis of an old limited database. Now, we have here evidence to reinforce my paper. My first paper came out in 2005 after great difficulty, again, rejected by journals like the New England Journal of Medicine when I started trying to publish it in 2004. But it's still been a major breakthrough in showing, at least getting the IPN data in a format that was known to everyone, and to have some opposition to the basically monolith of the group that was controlling this field from the beginning. And so there were the point of this slide is there's 6 different cohorts in California, including mine, which is labeled CPS1, and then there's the CPS2 cohort, which is Jarrett, and that's been the one that's been used for almost all the studies that EPA relies upon. But there's others, the California Teachers Cohort, the original study by the Seventh-day Adventists at the top, and a new one called the NIH AARP study, which was published last year. Again, this is supposed to be an open database, but it got controlled by one of the people in the group called Thurston. I haven't been able to get full access to this, but his study shows no effect in California. If you average all 6 cohorts, you get exactly 1.00. So it's very clear. It's very clear there's no effect in California, and maybe that's why the California cities were omitted by Pope, because if you go from the high of Riverside County to the low of Santa Barbara, in my study, which I analyzed county by county, there was no difference, even though I was using the CPS1 database at that time. But it's true from what my new analysis shows. And so this, again, was the breakthrough, I think, that reinforced the map. In other words, there really is a tremendous geographic variation across the United States, and there's no risk in California. But guess where the most severe regulations are? They're in California. We'll get to that later. Okay, now this is a summary of both my analysis and the Thurston analysis on the AARP, NIH AARP cohort, and that shows that that there is a basic. Both cohorts show no effect nationwide, and there's no effect in California. This is a list of all the attempts I've made since March to get responses. I've gone to the president of HEI, their chief scientist, Cohen, to the lead authors, Pope and Krusky, to the chair of the board of HEI, Richard Celeste, former governor of Ohio, to the co-author, Michelle Turner from Canada, who did her PhD dissertation on the CPS2 database. And I made a repeat request to Cohen, who was in charge of manage this whole reanalysis project. On July 4th, I wrote to the actual person that does the analyses, the ACS data core director, Ryan Diver, no response. And just last week, I asked Diver, Gapster, and Pope. Gapster is the key epidemiologist at the American Cancer Society, to provide, if they could provide information, they could come to this conference or call in or whatever to give their rebuttal to what I've done. Nothing, no response. Now, what did they do in response? Well, they wrote a letter. There's going to be letters, follow-up letters in the journal Dose Response. They wrote a letter May 9th. The 6 principals here, Pope, Krusky, Gapster, Turner, Jarrett, and Burnett. They didn't confirm or refute anything in my paper. They made some statements that are just blatantly false. First of all, they say the assertion regarding selective use of CPS2 and PM2.5 data is false. Well, I've just shown you that I did show there's an effect of the selective data. It's not clear how or why this IPN PM2.5 data is different from the HEI PM2.5 data. Well, I showed you the table where their specific differences exist, and they could see that table as well as anyone. And then, this is the arrogance of these people. Then they write, after all of this controversy that's existed ever since they published, they say, quote, the study by Enstrom does not contribute to the larger body of evidence on the health effects of PM2.5. Just basically, wipe out everything I've done and wipe out all the critics that have been criticizing them for over 2 decades. This is the background on Cleve Arden Pope III, the instigator of most of this, who's a professor of economics at BYU and self-proclaimed world's leading expert on the health effects of air pollution. He got his PhD in 1981 in agricultural economics at Ohio State University on the dynamics of crop yields in the Corn Belt. That really qualifies him to be an epidemiologist in my mind. I mean, come on, folks. Now, in other words, what I've done here is I've listed all the attempts made since my paper came out in 2005, and shows the just total lack of cooperation and even defying a congressional subpoena. This is how arrogant this guy is. They just will not. They will not do anything except keep pushing their agenda. Next is Michael Jarrett, who is one of the key and most prolific publishers as the original part of the HEI Reanalysis team. He has a 1996 PhD in geography from the University of Toronto on green costs, red ink. Again, not trained formally as an epidemiologist, but using epidemiologic methods to put out a tremendous number of papers and just flood the journals. Again, he has not complied. There have been very specific complaints of misconduct filed against him at UCLA and elsewhere. He's bounced around the state of California, USC, UC Berkeley, and he's actually now at UCLA doing what I used to be doing, or am still doing, but he's paid for it, and I'm out. It's just we come to different conclusions. So I'm the politically incorrect scientist. In any case, we do have a concession. At the bottom of the slide, the Office of Research Integrity officer that looked at this agreed that the 2013 paper that Jarrett had on California didn't show any effect. And yet they managed to try and parse out an effect. Now, the ACS officials are actually the worst because they're allowing their data to be used now for over 20 years for a purpose that has nothing to do with cancer and is being used to implement very severe regulations in the United States. And I've highlighted a number of the key points here. Again, there's not time to go into this in great detail, but the point is they're still not responding. They haven't responded to any of the requests, and they haven't even criticized me from having data that I shouldn't have. Now, this is on HEI's president, Daniel Greenbaum. And again, he's at least talked with me, but hasn't really done anything significant. Won't force these investigators to do analyses. He's supposed to be in charge of this. They were paid millions of dollars to do this, but they're not under obligation to address any of the concerns. But maybe the most insulting thing that he's done, and this has all occurred since I started dealing with my paper published, was on June 21st of this year, less than 2 months ago, he accepted what CARB calls the Nobel Prize in sustained leadership on air pollution health science. I mean, that shows the arrogance of CARB and Mary Nichols that they can call their Ari Haagenschmidt Award the Nobel Prize. And Ari Haagenschmidt was a tremendous aerosol chemist from Caltech, and they started that agency off on the right foot, but it's now totally corrupt. Now, this, what you do to go against these people is you find evidence that they themselves have published. And this is a table in an obscure journal that is never cited by these investigators. Jarrett's the lead author on this, and the journal name is at the top there of that cutout. And they show if you divide their results up into 5 periods, they don't get a significant effect anywhere. And this is their own study analysis. And so this is another thing that needs to be addressed. They haven't cited this paper to my knowledge. It was given to me by Dr. Lipfert recently. He found it because he's done so many great analyses and on this, been a great resource. Next, they published, and this is all after what I've done, they published this major paper in Lancet called, it's part of this global burden of disease project, which is headed by Aaron Cohen, the chief scientist at HEI. Pope's a co-author on this. But here's how you use their own data against them. They show that actually on the worldwide basis, the United States, even though they're claiming 88,000 deaths, when I believe the number is 0, that number is a lot lower than the several hundred or 500,000 deaths that's been floated by people at EPA. And they're showing the mean PM2.5 level now in the United States is only 8.4 micrograms per cubic meter. That's a tremendous reduction from what it was, say, 25 years ago. And the death rate is low here also. Far lower than in China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. So of all they claim there's 4,200,000 deaths worldwide. Only 88,000 of them are in the United States. So clearly this is a problem. If it exists outside the United States. Here is a slide that comes from the World Health Organization. And this, again, reinforces that the PM2.5 levels are high in, well, you can see, Africa, India, China. They're very low in the United States. So even if there was some truth to this claim of deaths, the problem exists outside the United States. This is, again, going through this quickly, my history of rejections by the New England Journal of Medicine since 2004, when I submitted my first paper, and it's continued. There are various manuscripts that have been submitted in 2015. I started this, my current publication in June of 2016 with the New England Journal of Medicine. You just can't get into that journal unless you come up with a positive finding. Now, I do have a criticism of a paper they published at the end of June by the Harvard group, and they haven't rejected that letter yet. And so we're going to see whether they actually publish a letter of mine. And this is I believe Steve Malloy is going to talk more about this. That paper is a real abomination, but they published it. I've also had rejections from Science. Science has been not a big player in this, but they've published over the years a number of things where they should have been at least willing to seriously consider this issue, because they've covered the issue since the beginning. But again, these were submissions that were made mainly in 2015 and 16. No response. They didn't even do peer review. At least the New England Journal did peer review on my papers. And so we have major biases in the major journals. This is a bill that's the most recent version of the Secret Science Reform Act, is now called the Honest Act. It was approved by the full House in March. It's awaiting action in the Senate. Reforms requires EPA to rely upon science that is transparent and reproducible. Not a bad concept. And also requires reform in the Science Advisory Board so that it's more reflective of all viewpoints. Now, these are I'm going to quote from two sources that came out 2 years ago. And this is the editor of Lancet himself, kind of a ultra, activist, but even he realized, at some point you realize you've got to say some obvious facts. This was one that he wrote, this is an editorial he wrote on April 11th of 2015. Science has taken a turn toward darkness. And again, it's reinforcing that there's a lot of problems in what is being published in science now. And so I would read this, and he states, case against science is straightforward. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. What an amazing statement. That is just shocking. Now, this is followed up by a editorial in the New York Times. The liberal New York Times even wrote about scientists who cheat. This is June 1st of 2015. Cheating in scientific and academic papers is a long-standing problem, and it concludes with a very obvious thing. It can start, the reform can start by ensuring that scientists, especially peer reviewers, are allowed to see the underlying data of a paper. That's exactly what I've gotten access to and what should be available on all of these various studies. Now, I'm going to conclude by mentioning three historical figures. And these are all people you realize the importance of these people when you look back at a history of science. This is a man, maybe the most notorious scientist in terms of the notoriety he's received, a plant geneticist from the Soviet Union, Nikolai Vavilov, who was imprisoned by Joseph Stalin and died of basic malnutrition in, I believe, Siberia. for believing in honest genetics. And so Soviet agriculture was ruined because of this man, Trofim Denisovich Lysenko, who was a phony plant geneticist, but got the favor of Joseph Stalin because he didn't believe in Mendelian genetics. And he controlled much of the Soviet agriculture during the 30s and 40s and 50s, he even outlasted Stalin, but finally this was uncovered in the mid-60s in the United States. But here I did a quick summary of Lysenko pseudoscience was using phony crop claims and plant genetics and purging dissenting scientists. Only there, because of Joseph Stalin, they were able to get rid of people like Vavilov by actually killing them. At least Willie and I are still alive. So I really am thankful for that. And so much of this is an analogy with particulate matter pseudoscience that's existed, where you have a few select scientists like Pope publishing the articles, the dissenting scientists like myself and Fred Lipfert, Bob Phelan. Bob's been more successful than most of us in working with these people. But in any case, we're basically very poorly funded and ignored, and we can't get traction because of the activists that control so much of this. And so now we have an opening because of the new EPA that we can try to get reforms. Now, the next person is one that I never thought I'd present in a scientific forum, but he's actually very appropriate because he, in my belief, embodies a lot of what has gone on in this particular arena. And you may recognize him. This is, most people don't realize that Sinclair Lewis was the first American to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. He understood human nature incredibly well, especially in small towns. And he wrote this series of books mainly in the 20s. Elmer Gantry came out in 27. In my view, it should have been Mark Twain, but Mark Twain died only a few years after the Nobel Prize was established, and so they probably didn't really get a full understanding of how important Mark Twain was. But in any case, this is where you have this itinerant preacher who is able to sell almost anything to gullible people. And so we have this situation now where you have somebody like Professor Pope and another professor at Harvard named Joel Schwartz able to convince people that inhaling 1 gram of invisible particles over a lifetime is going to cause premature death? How could any concept like that take hold unless it was done by people as diabolically brilliant as the modern day Elmer Gantrys? And so this is what we're up against, but it's beatable as long as enough people care. And so we need more effort on people caring, and we can actually stop this stuff. Basically, I'm going to conclude with there is strong evidence from 2 major cohorts now that there's no premature deaths due to PM2.5, and there's strong evidence that this relationship's been falsified by EPA, Health Effects Institute, and lead researchers for over 20 years. The House bills that I mentioned on Honest Act and so forth really need to be implemented, and the EPA NACs need to be completely reassessed. The exemption that California's gotten away with, called the California Waiver of the Clean Air Act, needs to no longer be granted. This is how California has gotten away with things that are even worse than EPA. And we need an aggressive campaign against these U.S. Researchers who conduct this pseudoscience. And that can be done by additional help from the people in this room. And I really appreciate the opportunity to give this talk. Before I close, I want to say one thing about a personal hero of mine. And this is a person that's been to many, many of these meetings. He's a fellow physicist. His full name is Siegfried Friedrich Singer of Austria. I like to refer to him as one of the last remaining members of the von Trapp family singers, because he was able to get out of Austria and live to the age, wonderful age that he has now. And so we need to keep moving forward, and now is the opportunity. This year is a real opportunity we have. And so thank you again for the opportunity to speak.